It all started with a knock that went unanswered, but it wasn't just any knock. It was the kind of knock that set off a chain reaction no one in our quiet neighborhood would ever forget. The sound echoed across our front porch like a judge's gavel, full of entitlement and frustration. But the thing is, no one inside the house heard it. Not me, sitting in the living room watching a football game with the volume cranked up, and definitely not my wife, Julia, who was in the backyard tending to her garden with noise-canceling earbuds in. The woman behind the knock was Karen, our infamous HOA president. And what she didn't know, what would soon turn her whole day upside down, was that the woman she was trying to intimidate wasn't just another neighbor. She was the city's newly appointed police chief. But to understand why Karen knocked in the first place, you have to understand the kind of person she is. Karen isn't your average neighbor. She's a textbook control freak, the kind who measures grass height with a ruler and has filed complaints over things as ridiculous as mismatched patio furniture and decorative birdhouses. To her, the HOA wasn't just a community guideline, it was a badge of authority. And she wore it like she was running a military base instead of a peaceful suburban street. The reason she came knocking that morning, Julia had planted a row of bright, golden sunflowers along the side of our fence just a few inches over the arbitrary planting zone defined in the HOA handbook. Mind you, the sunflowers were beautiful, neat, well-kept, not obstructing anything or bothering anyone. But Karen had a rule, and rules were made to be enforced. She had seen the flowers while walking her little designer dog that morning and had probably been stewing about them for hours before she decided it was time to take action. She showed up in her typical power walk, clipboard in hand, sunglasses. Unlike she was about to do a real estate inspection, she marched up the steps of our porch and knocked hard 3 times, then paused, then knocked again, even harder. Our doorbell cam caught the whole thing, including the way she stood there with one hand on her hip, tapping her foot like she was waiting for a servant. When no one answered, her irritation bubbled over. Unbelievable, she muttered loud, enough for the camera mic to catch. They think they're above everyone else. She knocked again, longer this time, and then began mumbling something about writing a citation. But no one came to the door. Inside, I was yelling at the TV about a missed touchdown. Julia, out back, was humming softly to herself, crouched over a rosebush, completely oblivious. We weren't ignoring Karen, we literally didn't hear her. But to Karen, it wasn't just being ignored. It was insubordination. And that, in her mind, demanded consequences. She didn't just walk away quietly. No, she stormed down our front steps, ranting under her breath. And by the time she reached the sidewalk, she was already on the phone. She dialed 911, not the non-emergency police line. Not the HOA board, but the actual emergency line reserved for life-threatening situations. Her voice, as caught by the camera, was high-pitched and dramatic. "Yes, I'm at the residence of a non-compliant neighbor," she said. "She refuses to answer the door. And she may be armed. I'm an HOA president conducting official business and I feel threatened." That tiny sentence about feeling threatened and possibly armed changed everything. Dispatchers take that kind of language seriously. It doesn't matter if you're calling from a mansion or a shack. If someone says there's a potentially armed person acting suspiciously, units are going to respond. And respond, they did. While Karen stood smugly by the curb, with her arms crossed, 2 patrol cars quietly rolled into the cul-de-sac. Their lights flashed low, rotating red and blue, and neighbors peeked out their blinds as the vehicles pulled up right in front of our house. The officers stepped out carefully, one of them placing a hand lightly on his holstered sidearm. From the inside, I finally noticed something was off when the lights reflected off the TV screen. I stood up, walked over to the window, and felt a pit form in my stomach when I saw the cops approaching. My first thought was something had happened nearby, a break-in, a fugitive on the run. It never occurred to me that the problem was supposed to be us. I opened the door just as Karen marched up to the officers with a big, self-satisfied grin. She pointed toward our backyard. "That's her," she said with a sense of importance. "She's in the back, hiding." She didn't answer when I knocked, and I saw she was carrying something that looked like a gun earlier. "She's dangerous and refuses to comply with HOA standards." The officers looked at each other, clearly skeptical. One of them began walking around the side of the house while the other approached the door. I stepped out and said, "Excuse me, what's going on here?" The officer held up a hand and said, "Sir, we received a report about a potential safety concern. We just need to speak with the individual on the property." I was confused but didn't resist. "My wife's in the backyard," I said. "She's probably gardening. She's not a threat to anyone." Just then, Julia appeared, around the corner, holding pruning shears and a gardening glove in one hand, sweat dripping down her brow. Completely unaware of the situation. She froze when she saw the officers, then slowly pulled the earbuds out of her ears. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The officer nearest to her tensed slightly, then asked politely, "Ma'am, may I see some identification?" Julia didn't hesitate. She reached into her back pocket, pulled out her wallet, and handed him a sleek leather badge holder. When he opened it, his eyes widened, and he straightened up immediately. "Chief," he asked, glancing at his partner. The other officer, who had just reached the backyard, returned and took one look at the badge before realizing the mistake. Karen, who had followed them toward the gate, now stood frozen in place, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. You're the police chief," she stammered. Julia nodded, calmly slipping her badge back into her pocket. "Yes, and you just called in a false emergency report on a law enforcement officer over a garden disagreement." Karen opened and closed her mouth like she was trying to catch her breath, but nothing came out. Julia turned to the officers. "Would you mind explaining why this was escalated as a dangerous situation, and why 2 units were dispatched to my home over a flower bed?" One of the officers gave Karen a look that said, "You're on your own now," and stepped back. "We'll let the chief handle this," he muttered. Karen stood there, her clipboard dangling at her side, the reality finally sinking in. She hadn't just tried to intimidate a neighbor. She had unknowingly called the police on the police chief, and now she was the one about to face some very real consequences. Karen didn't waste a second after walking off our porch. She stomped down the driveway like she was marching into battle, muttering to herself and already dialing the number on her phone. She was on the HOA board, actually, president, but in her mind, that made her some kind of neighborhood law enforcement. And to her, someone not answering the door was more than rude, it was insubordination. According to the footage from our security cameras, she stood at the corner of our street, pacing like a general, phone pressed to her ear. The 911 call she made was short but exaggerated in all the worst ways. She told the dispatcher, "Yes, I'm here on official HOA business, and a woman is refusing to comply. She's hostile, possibly armed. I feel unsafe." She didn't say anything about flowers. Nothing about the gardening. Just painted a picture that would trigger an immediate response, and it worked. Within 6 minutes, 2 patrol units arrived. Lights on, sirens off, like they were handling a delicate situation. Officers stepped out, hands on belts, scanning the property like they expected a barricaded suspect. Meanwhile, Julia was still in the backyard, clipping away at a stubborn rosebush with her earbuds in. Unaware of the chaos brewing out front, I had just gotten up to grab a soda when I saw the flashing lights through the blinds. My stomach dropped. I opened the door to see Karen standing beside the officers, pointing toward the backyard with this smug satisfaction, like she'd won something. "That's her," she told them. "She lives here. That's the one who ignored me and has an illegal flower bed growing past regulation. And I think she has a weapon. She always does." The younger of the 2 officers raised his eyebrows slightly, but said nothing. The older one gave Karen a quick nod and started walking toward the side gate. I stepped out, calling out, "Hey, what's going on?" The officer held up a hand and said, "We received a report about a possible threat. We just need to check. Everything's okay." That's when Julia stepped around the corner, gloves on, sweatpants dirty, a smear of soil on her cheek. She saw the cops and paused, confused. Then, when she recognized the older officer, she pulled her earbuds out and said, "Frank, what are you doing here?" He froze. "Julia?" he asked, eyes widening. "You're the one they called about?" Julia looked between him and the patrol cars. "Called about what?" she asked. "I've been gardening. What happened?" The second officer approached, a little more cautious now, and asked, "Can we see some ID, ma'am?" Julia nodded calmly, pulled off one glove, and reached into her back pocket where her wallet always sits, badge and ID included. "Sure," she said, handing it over. "Chief, Julia Martinez, City Police Department. You 2 want to explain what you're doing on my property." Karen's expression morphed from smug to confused to horrified in a matter of seconds. "Wait, what?" she said. You're the police chief." Julia didn't even look at her. She was locked in with the officers now, her voice low and firm. "You got dispatched here on a false report about an armed woman. Over what? Gardening." The senior officer looked deeply embarrassed. "We were told someone here was uncooperative and possibly armed," he muttered. "We didn't know it was you." Karen tried to speak again, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know who she was. But she ignored my knock and she always has that firearm. So I thought." Julia turned toward her then, calm, but cold. "You thought what? That you'd abuse 911 because someone didn't answer the door. You thought wasting emergency resources over a landscaping issue was the right move." Karen blinked, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I was just doing my duty as HOA president." Julia let out a quiet laugh. "Your duty? You don't have any legal authority. You called the police on a citizen over flowers. You called them on the police chief herself. You realize how serious that is." The 2 officers stood silently, clearly trying not to make things worse. I watched from a few feet away, amazed. Karen was visibly trembling now. "It was a misunderstanding," she insisted. "I didn't know you were the chief." Julia raised an eyebrow. So if I wasn't, would it have been okay? If I were just someone else, would it be fine to call in a fake weapons report over HOA landscaping? Karen didn't answer. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Julia looked at the officers. I'll be filing a formal report. This kind of false call puts lives in danger. What if someone else had answered that knock? What if someone less trained, more nervous, came outside when you pulled up? The younger officer nodded. You're right, Chief, we're sorry this happened. We didn't know. The older officer cleared his throat. We'll file it as a civil dispute. Note the miscommunication and the misuse of emergency dispatch. If you need anything else, you can call me directly. Julia thanked them, still calm but unmistakably in command. They left, heads down, and Karen stood there like she didn't know what to do next. I'll be talking to the HOA board, she stammered, but the words were weak. Julia just turned and walked back to the garden. You do that, she called over her shoulder, and maybe tell them to stop knocking on doors they don't understand. I stood next to Karen for a moment, looking at her like she was a math problem that didn't add up. You really called the cops on your neighbor over sunflowers? I asked. She didn't answer, just turned and walked away, her little clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon she couldn't use anymore. The moment my wife handed over her badge and ID to the officers, everything in the air shifted. It was like someone flipped a switch from confusion to stunned realization. The older officer stiffened up immediately, his eyes scanning the credentials. With disbelief, the younger one, who had been standing a little behind, leaned forward to look at the ID, then stepped back, blinking like he'd just walked into a test he didn't study for. Chief Julia Martinez, the senior officer said, barely above a whisper. You're the new chief. Julia nodded calmly, slipping her ID back into her back pocket. She didn't raise her voice, didn't make a scene. She didn't need to. Her tone alone carried the weight of someone who had faced far worse situations than this, and who now realized she was standing in the middle of something not dangerous but absolutely outrageous. Yes, she said clearly, and I'd like to know why 2 officers were dispatched to my home in response to a report that I was armed and hostile, while I was in my backyard clipping rose bushes. Karen, who had been hovering nearby, clutching her clipboard like a shield, suddenly found herself under an invisible spotlight. Her smug expression vanished. I didn't know who she was, she blurted out, her voice trembling. She didn't answer when I knocked, and I saw her carrying something that could have been a weapon. I didn't know she was the chief. Julia turned to face her for the first time, her gaze calm but unwavering. So you called 911 and said you felt threatened over a garden tool because someone didn't answer their door. You escalated a neighborhood disagreement into an emergency response involving armed officers. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Julia didn't give her the chance. Let me explain something to you, she said. When you call 911 and use language like possibly armed or hostile, you are initiating a serious response. Officers approach homes cautiously, guns drawn. In some cases, that kind of language can get people hurt or killed. You risked my safety. You risked their safety, and all because your HOA rules were ignored for a few inches of sunflower. The younger officer looked down at his boots. The older one sighed and stepped slightly to the side, as if distancing himself from the mess. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, her confidence gone. I didn't mean for it to go that far, she mumbled, almost to herself. I thought she was ignoring me on purpose. I thought maybe she was hiding something. Julia's expression didn't soften. She simply crossed her arms and said, you thought wrong. And instead of waiting, following HOA procedures, or even filing a formal complaint like a reasonable adult, you tried to flex power you don't have. She turned back to the officers. You 2 did your job, based on the report you received, but let me make something clear. I will be filing a complaint about the misuse of emergency services, and I will be speaking to your precinct about how false reports are handled. The older officer nodded slowly. Yes, Chief, we completely understand, and we're sorry. We had no idea. He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. They'd been manipulated. Karen's report had been filled with just enough misleading language to trigger a response, and now it was clear it had been nothing more than a personal vendetta. A flowerbed feud that spiraled into an incident that could have gone terribly wrong. The irony was thick. Karen had always believed she had the ultimate authority in the neighborhood. She wore her HOA presidency like a crown, handing out citations like they were gold coins. But now, confronted with someone who actually held real authority, who could command police departments, oversee city safety operations, and knew exactly how dangerous false reports could be, Karen was shrinking before our eyes. I stood silently by the door, taking in the scene with a strange mixture of shock and satisfaction. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell Karen off for all the times she harassed us and our neighbors. But Julia had already done more with a few quiet sentences than any rant ever could. Her calm dismantling of Karen's power trip was precise and devastating. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, Julia spoke again, this time to me. Can you show them the footage?" she asked. I nodded, pulled out my phone, and opened the app connected to our doorbell camera. I played the clip of Karen knocking aggressively, muttering about us being above the rules, and then walking away to call 911. The officers watched carefully. The younger one frowned, shaking his head as Karen's voice was clearly recorded saying she felt threatened despite no visible danger. "This isn't just a misunderstanding," he muttered. "This is a clear misuse." Julia nodded. "Exactly." Karen, now visibly shaking, tried one last time to salvage her pride. "I was just doing what's best for the neighborhood," she whispered. "I didn't mean any harm." Julia turned toward her one last time. "Then maybe you should start treating your neighbors like neighbors," she said. "Not suspects. You're not a cop. And this isn't a courtroom. It's a community." With that, she turned and walked back toward the backyard, slipping her gloves back on as if the whole ordeal had been a minor distraction from her afternoon gardening. The officers gave Karen one final glance, said nothing, and followed Julia's lead, quietly returning to their squad cars. The entire interaction had lasted no more than 15 minutes. But in that short time, Karen's entire sense of power and control had unraveled. As the patrol cars pulled away, Karen stood at the edge of the lawn, unsure what to do next. Her clipboard, once held like a sort of authority, now dangled uselessly at her side. I looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You called the cops on the police chief. Let that sink in for a bit." She didn't respond. She turned and walked away slowly, head down, her heels crunching against the driveway with each stiff, retreating step. I stepped back into the house, closed the door behind me, and let out a long breath. Julia came in a few minutes later, sat down at the kitchen table, and poured herself a glass of iced tea. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Her presence alone had already spoken volumes. That night, we uploaded the doorbell footage to our cloud account. Not to go viral, not to embarrass anyone, but just in case. But we didn't need to share it publicly ourselves. By the next morning, someone else on the street had already posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group, and it was spreading like wildfire. Karen had spent years turning the neighborhood into her personal fief. Now, in less than 24 hours, the throne had crumbled beneath her. And the best part, Julia never raised her voice, never threatened. She just stood there, calm and composed, and let Karen fall on her own sword. The irony was poetic. Karen had always warned others about calling the wrong kind of attention to themselves. But in the end, she was the one who brought flashing lights and uniformed officers to our peaceful cul-de-sac call because someone didn't answer her knock. All because she didn't recognize that behind that backyard fence, wearing sweatpants and gardening gloves, was someone who'd spent her life defending the land, knew exactly how to handle someone abusing it. Asterisk. By the time the patrol cars pulled away and the dust had settled, the atmosphere in our neighborhood had completely shifted. Word travels fast on our streets, especially when Karen is involved, and within an hour, everyone knew that she had called 911 on someone for ignoring her knock, only to find out that the woman she accused was the police chief herself. The footage from our doorbell camera quickly became the smoking gun. It was crystal clear, Karen pounding on the door, muttering insults, storming away, and calling the police under false pretenses. Within minutes of us downloading the video, someone from down the block, probably Jeff, the guy who runs the local Facebook group, uploaded the clip with a title that read, "When HOA Karen Tries to Flex on the Police Chief." That video went viral in the neighborhood within hours. Comments poured in, some laughing, others expressing disbelief, and more than a few neighbors openly admitted they'd had run-ins with Karen's obsessive rule enforcement before. What was once whispered at backyard barbecues was now being typed. In bold caps, on community threads, people shared their own Karen horror stories. One neighbor, Sheila, posted about the time she got fined for hanging her Christmas lights too early. Another neighbor mentioned how Karen had threatened to report his teenage son for having a skateboard ramp in their driveway, claiming it was an eyesore. Someone else commented that Karen had once measured the distance between trash cans and the curb with a tape measure. Now, all of those petty complaints were being revisited with a new lens, everyone realizing how out of control she had become. But this incident with Julia, this was the final straw. That very night, the vice president, an older gentleman named Tom, who everyone liked and respected, sent out an official email calling for an emergency board meeting. The subject line was simple: urgent, HOA, misconduct review, attendance required. It didn't take a genius to figure out what that meant. Karen, who for years had walked around the neighborhood as if she were a sheriff in a one-horse town, was finally facing the consequences of her behavior. At the meeting the next evening, more than 30 residents showed a record turnout for any HOA event. People didn't just come to watch, they came ready to speak. Julia and I sat quietly in the back, sipping lukewarm coffee while person after person stood up and shared stories of Karen's harassment, intimidation, and her constant threats of HOA fines for minor or imagined infractions. Karen tried to defend herself at first. She claimed she was only trying to uphold community standards, She said she felt threatened when no one answered the door. She even said she was concerned for safety. But every excuse fell flat. The footage, the 911 transcript, the unnecessary dispatch of officers, it was all too clear. She had misused emergency services, misled the police, and put our safety and the officers' safety at risk all because of a few flowers and her bruised ego. When it came time to vote on whether she should be removed as HOA president, it was unanimous. Not a single hand raised in her favor. Even her usual supporters stayed silent, too embarrassed or unwilling to go down with her. The very next week, the HOA held a special election, and the new president was someone everyone trusted, Mrs. Langston, a retired school principal with a calm demeanor and zero tolerance for nonsense. She made it clear in her first address that her job wasn't to bully people or obsess over inches of garden space. "This is a community," she said, "not a dictatorship. Let's remember that." Her message hit home. Almost immediately, the vibe in the neighborhood started to change. People were smiling more. Kids played outside again without being scolded. There were fewer passive-aggressive notices taped to front doors and more friendly chats over fences. The drama that had once filled every monthly HOA meeting slowly faded into something better: neighborly cooperation. That's for Karen. Well, she stayed in the neighborhood, but she wasn't the same. Her clipboard disappeared. Her power walks turned into quiet strolls, and she stopped trying to enforce rules with a glare. Occasionally, I'd see her walk past our home with her little dog, eyes on the ground, refusing to make eye contact. She never apologized, not directly, but her silence spoke volumes. And Julia, she went right back to tending her garden, this time with noise-canceling headphones turned down just a bit in case someone actually needed her attention. Her sunflowers grew tall, bright, and legal thanks to the new board approving a flexible flower bed policy that same month. Funny how things change when the right people are in charge. One afternoon, a few weeks after it all blew over, one of the officers who responded to that 911 call dropped by the house not to investigate, but just to visit. He handed Julia a thank you card signed by everyone in his unit. Inside, there was a handwritten message that read, "Thank you for reminding us what leadership looks like. And sorry we showed up with flashing lights over a gardening dispute." Julia laughed, stuck the card on our fridge, and offered him some iced tea. Moments like that reminded us how absurd the whole thing had been, but also how lucky we were that no one got hurt. The scariest part of the entire ordeal wasn't just the misuse of emergency services, it was how quickly a simple knock on a door could spiral into something dangerous. All because someone with too much authority and too little judgment couldn't handle being ignored. That's the real story. It wasn't just Karen getting embarrassed. It was a community realizing that power without responsibility is dangerous. And that sometimes, the badge you try to use against someone might belong to someone with a much bigger badge. So if you're ever tempted to call the cops because someone didn't answer your knock, take a breath. Ask yourself, is it worth it? Is it real? Or are you just trying to feel powerful? Because you never know who lives on the other side of that door. It might just be the police chief, and next time, she might not be in a good mood.